My name is Peter Woolley. I get to be the provost on this campus, and sometimes that's a lot of fun. Sometimes I get to do the welcome, and that's the first item on your program. So we have several people to welcome. I think that we have quite a few students from the Metro campus. Is that true? It is true. Would you guys stand up? Huh? Yeah. Let's give them a hand, huh? And a timely entrance by President Drucker. Let's give him a hand. So the question was put earlier to President Drucker, on which campus do you spend more time? And he quickly said he's very careful to spend his time equally among the New Jersey campuses. And the conversation then segued into the Vanderbilts and where they spent their time. Most of you here know that this estate, this campus, is a Vanderbilt heritage, and they're here with us all the time. This is Hamilton Twombly and Florence Vanderbilt at the opposite end, so they're always with us. And they had many houses. They had this house, of course. They had a house in New York City on Park Avenue. They had a summer house in Newport. And I like to think that FDU has carried on that Vanderbilt tradition of having many houses. We have Metro, Florham, Vancouver, and Roxton Abbey. I also want to welcome our resident ambassador, Hamid Al-Biati. He has added professor to his many titles, and he now teaches for the university. He's teaching now at the Metro campus as well.
Some students from my class.
And some students from your class have joined us. That's excellent. So I will simply turn it over now to Dr. Jason Scorza, who I like to describe as bon vivant, man about the world, as well as Vice Provost for Academic and International Affairs.
Thank you, Peter. I would like to welcome all of you to this episode of our UN Pathways series. For those of you who are with us for the first time, the format for our program will be a conversation between Ambassador Harold Braun and myself. We will then have a period of questions and answers at the end from the audience. So please, when the time comes, signal your interest in asking a question vigorously. Please be aware that we are videotaping and audio recording these proceedings. So I would ask you to ensure that your telephones are turned off. And that if you do need to move around the room, you do so as quietly as you can. We are deeply honored today to have Ambassador Braun, the permanent representative from Germany to the United Nations, who has brought spring with him. I hope very much that spring stays after you have departed, but I know you cannot make any assurances in that regard.
Stay close.
Yes. Ambassador Braun has held many senior positions in the German Foreign Service and is perhaps unique among senior diplomats in having taken a sabbatical to work in the private sector as a corporate vice president for the Siemens Corporation, which of course has a very significant presence here in New Jersey as well. We're going to be talking today about a lot of different questions. Questions about Germany, questions about the EU, questions about the UN. But I wonder if there's anything that you would like to get off your chest to get us started.
Well, I think I should use this opportunity not to lecture you on Germany, but maybe to give you a few facts and figures on my home country before we start with the questions and answers. But first of all, let me say that I'm very happy to be here. This is a very prestigious university in on a memorable campus and in a historic mansion. So it's not only an honor, but also a pleasure to be here. Coming from New York, I suddenly felt at home in New Jersey when I learned that you have mandatory recycling, which is mandated by law in this state. That makes me feel at home, because in Germany we are very environment-minded. Why are we environment-minded? We don't have so much environment. Germany has a population of a bit over 80 million people. That is a quarter of the population of the United States. But the country has the same size as Montana. So we live under very much more dense conditions than you in the United States. And if we don't take care of our environment at one point, it will not be there anymore, or conditions will be such that that no one wants to live there anymore. So this is the population and the size of our country. What is interesting to me is that Germany is slightly growing its population. Why is it growing its population? Because we have quite a bit of immigration. Not as much as the United States. I have the figures here. Population growth in Germany has been 0.3% for the past 10 years, in the United States 0.7% per year, but both these growth rates were stimulated by immigration, not by domestic birth rates. And what might be interesting for you is that the percentage of foreign-born population in Germany is slightly higher than in the United States. It's 13% in the United States and 13.1% in Germany. Now, the United States has always considered itself an immigration country. In Germany, we for a long time were not aware of the fact that we are so attractive for immigrants, but figures show that this is the case. In 2012 alone, and this is the last year from which I have OECD statistics, Germany attracted 400,000 migrants. Considering the continent of Europe, Germany is the second most populous country after Russia. And it is not the largest country in the European Union, but it is the country with the biggest population. 80 million versus 55, roughly between 50 and 55 in Britain and France, which are number 2 and 3 in the European Union. If we look at the economy, and again compared to the United States, which of course has the largest GDP in the world, with 17.4 trillion US dollars, Germany has the 4th largest GDP, close to 4 trillion. That is a little bit less than 25% of the United States. And numbers 2 and 3 are China and Japan. So Germany is number 4 after these 3 countries, but ahead of France and the UK with 2.7, 2.5 respectively. Our GDP is growing at a rate of about 1.5% last year, in the United States 2%. The per capita income in Germany is close to 45,000 US dollars. In the United States, it's 53,000 US dollars. Germany has approximately the same unemployment rate as the United States, 5.5%. It has the lowest unemployment rate in Europe, and also the lowest youth unemployment in Europe. There are reasons for this, which maybe we can later address. When it comes to trade, The United States and Germany are the world's second and third biggest trading nations behind China, with imports and exports totaling 4 billion for the United States and 3 billion for Germany respectively. Now these are gross trade figures, imports and exports. When you divide them up, the United States has a deficit of close to 5% of GDP, which means the United States is importing more than it is exporting. In Germany, the opposite is the case. We have a trade surplus of 7% of GDP, which means we are considerably more exporting than we are importing. Another figure that might be interesting for you is public social expenditure. How much do we spend on social, or how much does the state spend on social programs? In the United States, it's roughly 20%. In Germany, it's a little bit over 26% of GDP. Interesting for me was to learn that both our countries spend roughly the same percentage on health, namely 8% of GDP, while Germany, unlike the United States, has a global health coverage program for everybody, which is financed by these 8%. Maybe the last item I'd like to mention is energy. Since we are environment conscious, we have started years ago programs to move away from carbon-based energy supplies to renewable energies. And in 2014, over 27% of energy in Germany was produced from renewables. This is again important for a country that does not have its own carbon resources like the United States and other countries do. Another way to balance your energy balance is to save energy, and we have energy consumption reduction programs which have been in effect for a few years, and that has led in 2014 to a decrease in energy consumption by close to 4%. I think with these facts and figures, I put myself into your competent hands and be happy to start the discussion and answer your questions.
Thank you. Consider yourself now at the mercy. I'd like to continue with the theme of economics to get our conversation started. I read that Germany represents a full 20% of the GDP for the European Union as a whole, which is tremendously efficient, even in light of the size of your population. What is Germany doing right with regard to its economic policies and its economic activities that other countries could stand to learn from?
Well, I don't think we are in a position to teach other countries what to do, but I can try and explain to you a few basic factors of the German economy, factors which have probably contributed to an element of enduring economic stability and also financial stability. We do have a number of large corporations in Germany, but the overwhelming number of jobs is provided by small and medium-sized companies. And while large industrial complexes have been successful, also in exports and worldwide, it is these small and medium-sized companies that have produced more jobs over time that are still creating more jobs and that have attributed considerably to economic stability. If a small one fails, another small one very quickly enters into the market. If a big one fails, you feel the whole. So I think it's this broad basis of the economy in terms of enterprises that contributes to stability. Some of these small and medium-sized enterprises are big exporters because they produce elements, often high-tech, sometimes medium-tech elements that are needed by other companies worldwide. Some German companies specialize in a very small spectrum, but are world leaders. This is part of our export success, but it also gives a lot of stability to these small and medium-sized companies because they do not depend on the local market, they do not depend on 5 or 10 export markets only, but they are operating globally. Much of this is technology-based. We are very proud of our engineering schools. We are very proud of the high number of patents that are registered every year. And there is maybe another factor that has contributed to a bit of stability in the German economy, and that is our vocational training system. I just learned that Fairleigh Dickinson very early on has had programs combining liberal arts with a professional education. This sounds very familiar to me because in Germany we have had for centuries the tradition to train people simultaneously in schools and on the job in companies. We call this the dual system. The advantage is that if a company has to lay off people, they have relatively good perspectives to find a new job because they were not trained on the job in the company, but that they have a certificate which makes their qualification portable into other sectors of the economy.
Thank you. You mentioned immigration and migration as a significant factor, obviously in Germany's population growth and perhaps also its economic growth. Are the migrants who are coming in generally highly skilled professionals, or are they coming in for other sorts of jobs?
It's a mixture, like in most countries. There is the notion of the German economic miracle of the 60s and 70s. That was when we had double-digit growth rates, and the domestic workforce was not sufficient to produce for all the demand there was there. So Germany had programs to invite skilled workers from other European countries, mainly southern European countries. Many of these families stayed in Germany, and many of them acquired the German citizenship, others didn't. So we have a southern European population that came in the second half of the 20th century in this economic upswing. They came with their skills, and their descendants are usually very skilled people. We had later migration waves towards the end of the 20th century, early 21st century, where people came mainly from the continent of Africa for political reasons, for reasons of the known problems that exist on the continent of Africa. Fewer of those people came with skills. And like in other countries, there have been tensions between these recent immigrants, especially those who came without skills or with very little skills, and the established population. We have close to 4 million immigrants from Turkey alone, who are mostly Muslim, who came to a country with a long-standing Judo-Christian tradition. There have been tensions in this respect too. And immigration certainly also is a factor in the aspect that a few hundred young Germans or immigrants felt attracted to ISIS and have now decided to travel to Syria and to Iraq in order to fight there. These are migrants or descendants of migrant families, and this is of course seen with criticism and contributes to certain tensions. But I don't want to end on a negative note with this. The majority, the overwhelming majority of immigrants into Germany are totally adapted, absorbed, integrated. Many of these small and medium-sized companies were created by immigrants or descendants of immigrants. We have very successful third and fourth generation entrepreneurs in Germany who come from a foreign background. So the overall picture is a happy one, but there are problems.
You mentioned Turkey, and of course we know that Turkey has expressed interest in entering the European Union. Does Germany have an official position on this, or are there factors that Germany would like to see before serious consideration could be given to Turkish membership?
Germany has two major parties. Unlike the United States, we have other parties too, but the two major parties are a conservative party called Christian Democratic Union and the Social Democratic Party. And these two parties are currently together in government. Ms. Merkel, the Chancellor, who is the head of our government, belongs to the Conservative Party. Vice Chancellor, Foreign Minister, other members of cabinet belong to the Social Democratic Party. And these two parties have different official positions, which means our government position is neutral because it can be neither nor. The position of the Conservative Party is that Turkey should be as closely associated to the European Union as possible. The Social Democrats say Turkey, after a period of adaptation, especially of its economy, should have the perspective of becoming a full member of the European Union. So we are in kind of a limbo situation as far as European Union membership of Turkey is concerned.
Are there any countries that you would like to get rid
of? No. We hope that all member countries of the European Union and of the Eurozone will survive their financial troubles. And I learned that today Greece was able to secure yet another loan facility from the International Monetary Fund, and that yesterday the three institutions that are supervising Greece's reform program have resumed their work after the new Greek government had initially declared that their services would not be needed anymore. So we do hope that Greece will be able to stabilize by enjoying and putting to good use the support it has been getting and will be getting from other European Union countries, and at the same time will be faithful to the reform program that the Greek government has signed up to contractually, and this way get back on course and eventually become a supporting and strong member of the European Union again.
Well, I don't know why you assumed I was referring to Greece in my question. It could have been France. But let's stay on Greece for a few more minutes. They have almost catastrophic budget deficits. They owe more than 300 billion euros. I won't even try to imagine how much that is in US dollars, 500,000.
Not so much more anymore.
Yeah, well, sorry about that.
We don't want to blame all of this on Greece.
Yes. No. And you know, there's a sense, obviously, by some European nations that Greece brought their troubles upon themselves by overspending and perhaps by not having the most serious system of payment of taxes. Is it your sense that Greece, in fact, does have only itself to blame? Or is there something about the global monetary system, the global financial system, that puts smaller economies in greater jeopardy of these sorts of difficulties?
Greece consciously decided to join the Eurozone in order not to be entirely at the receiving end of the storms of international monetary fluctuation. If you are part of a larger currency, that helps you stabilize it. Now, at the same time, if you are part of a larger currency, you also have to make a contribution by adjusting your economic and fiscal policies to the overarching policies for the entire zone. I hope there are not too many economists in the room who are putting too much weight to what I'm saying. I'm not trying to be too technical because I don't know the technicalities, but if you belong to a larger currency union, you also have to make a contribution by adjusting your policies. And in this respect, Greece has homework to do. This was recognized by the previous Greek government. This was recognized by the finance ministers of the entire Eurozone. Therefore, the laundry list has been agreed of reforms that need to be introduced in Greece, and now these reforms just have to come about, and they do include, for example, proper tax collection. I mean, there must be a land register in order for a country or municipalities to be able to collect property taxes. There have to be appropriate mechanisms to collect property tax, income taxes, and so on and so forth. So these reforms are necessary, and without these reforms, it will be very difficult for Greece to stay in the Eurozone and enjoy the benefits of this larger currency area.
We hesitate, of course, to play the hypothetical game. And I'm sure everyone wishes Greece the best and hopes that they stay in the Union. But what would the consequence be, the hypothetical consequence be, of any member nation leaving the Eurozone?
Well, this depends, of course, on the size of the economy. You mentioned that the economy of Germany makes up about 20% of the European Union. Not all member countries of the European Union are also members of the Eurozone. We are 28 in the political union, and we are 19 in the Eurozone. So the weight of Germany in the Eurozone is close to 30%. You know, if the German economy faltered, this would hypothetically mean the end of the euro. Greece's economy is about 1% of the Eurozone. If Greece hypothetically should fall, this would certainly damage the euro's value vis-à-vis the dollar. And some of this we are already seeing by the markets, who always anticipate the worst, or who like to anticipate the worst. But it would not seriously damage the currency and the Eurozone as a whole.
There was some interesting news emerging from Greece the past 24 hours. Some senior officials of the Greek government have threatened to seize German assets in Greece if Germany fails to pay what they consider to be appropriate reparations from World War II. For me, this sort of came out of the blue, but has the issue of war reparations not been settled by now?
Yes, it has. No, this is like Loch Ness for us. It may be news for you, but it has been coming up time and again. The position of Germany, which has been confirmed by international treaties and also by the International Court of Justice, is that the reparation question is settled. Full stop.
So is this what we would call in the diplomatic trade a bluff? Or is there something more to these?
Well, I think it's. I wouldn't call it a bluff, but I would call it an attempt at influencing psychology. The new Greek government is trying to improve the terms of Greece's deal with the European Central Bank and with the International Monetary Fund and with the Commission of the European Union. And, you know, when you are dealing with a counterpart who is unwilling to come your way, you look for psychological instruments to make the other side more willing. And I would call this a psychological instrument.
And perhaps one of domestic propaganda? Maybe. You're not allowed to say, that's fine. You can see the subject makes you uncomfortable.
It certainly doesn't damage the image of the new Greek government domestically.
Let's turn to another corner of Europe where, of course, nothing bad could possibly happen, and that is the Ukraine. We've seen over the last couple of years political unrest in the Ukraine, followed by Russian military action in the Crimea, followed by proxy war, and perhaps not a proxy war entirely, in Ukraine proper. Germany has been diplomatically in the forefront of efforts to resolve these conflicts peacefully. Apart from the obvious and very meaningful humanitarian desire for there to be peace so people can get back to their lives, what interest does Germany have specifically in this conflict in the Ukraine?
Well, I think the first interest is indeed peace. Because we are dealing in this conflict not with a civil war in a country in the heart of Europe. but we are dealing with all the might, all the power, all the resources of the Red Army.
Do we still call it that?
No, we don't call that anymore, but that's what it is. And that is what makes the situation so complicated. We have a situation that can not be resolved militarily, whether we like it or not. There is no military solution short of the United States using their nuclear arsenal. But that's the unthinkable. So, we have a situation that cannot be resolved militarily. Therefore, we have to look at the instruments of diplomacy that are at our disposal. This is words, this is negotiations, this is programs, this is pressure, this is sanctions. What is the German interest? Germany, as the second largest, second most populous country on the continent after Russia, has a distinct interest in the maintenance of peace on the continent of Europe. There is economic interest also involved in all countries concerned, but the primary motive for Germany's diplomatic activity is not an economic one. We share and have even initiated all of the European Union's sanctions vis-à-vis Russia. This is hurting our economy, but we see this as an absolute necessity. We have made sure that the EU sanctions are in tune with the sanctions decreed by the United States, because we have to stand together as the West if we want to solve this peacefully, or if we want to solve this at all. And for us Germans, and after all the horrors of the 20th century, war in Europe has become unthinkable, and we simply feel obliged to use all our intelligence, all our diplomatic skills, all the pressure that we can apply in order to avoid a falling back into a hot war situation in Europe. We might not be able to prevent parts of Europe falling back into a kind of Cold War situation, but we don't want a hot war situation, and therefore we try everything that is in our might to avoid this.
You know, during the bipolar period of NATO and the Warsaw Pact, there was a sense that certain spheres of influence were off limits. And Europe, in its dividedness, was off limits. The proxy wars took place elsewhere. They took place in Asia and the Middle East and Africa. Why do you think it is that Europe is no longer off limits? And is this just a Russian problem, or is there something else going on in Europe?
Well, the way I see it, and I can only give you my personal view, is that this thinking in spheres of influence was slowly abolished during the Gorbachev period, with this opening of the Soviet Union for mainly economic reasons, because they noticed that they were not able to conduct this closed economy of the of the Comecon anymore, wanted more openness, therefore glasnost, perestroika, and in the wake of this opening of the Soviet Union, they permitted the Berlin Wall to fall and Germany be united, a country that before had belonged to two different spheres of influence. It was united. The spheres of influence slowly dissolved. Other member countries of the Warsaw Pact became members of NATO, became members of the European Union, and the Soviet Union, later Russia, looked at this, I would even call it benevolently, because they saw the economic advantage that came with it, the possibility to export oil and gas, large scale, modernize their industry. But what did not happen from the Russian perspective is that NATO dissolved as they had hoped, that NATO withdrew their troops from the Russian border as they had hoped, that Moscow was treated on an even eye level by Washington, that the European Union would step forward and offer Russia a generous association agreement. All these things did not happen, which probably led to a situation of frustration in the Russian leadership and a kind of withdrawal into a renewed thinking in spheres of influence and the defense of these spheres of influence. And that's where we are now.
We look often to economic sanctions as the response because the consequences of a military response are simply too horrible, certainly too unpredictable, but most likely too horrible. And yet we've seen time and time again that economic sanctions, A, don't necessarily hurt the leadership of countries who are violating international law, and secondly, may actually serve to consolidate the authority of such regimes who can turn to their people and say, well, we told you they're all bastards. We told you that they're conspiring against us. Here, do you need more proof? And that kind of puts diplomacy in a double bind. We do the thing because we have to do something, and we do the thing that has the least bad results, but not necessarily good results. In your experience, is there a third way?
In my experience, diplomacy is a tough trade, and it is often unrewarding because you rarely can show short-term results. Diplomacy always needs a period of time in order to show results. It's a very slow working medicine. Sanctions are only part of the diplomatic toolbox. Sanctions are not necessarily a medicine that can be applied to any disease. We call it targeted sanctions. Sanctions need to be targeted to the situation as far as the timing is concerned, as far as sectors are concerned, as far as individuals are concerned, as far as financial streams are concerned. Sanctions brought about the big change in South Africa. The change from apartheid to a democratic regime was brought about by sanctions, but only after 25 years. And after many people had completely given up hope and said sanctions will never work. Because who has an attention span of 25 years? Very.
Certain doctoral students who
Okay.
are familiar with them.
So, in the case of Russia, we do apply targeted sanctions. They have had an effect on the Russian economy. They have had limited effect on the Russian leadership so far. You are right. But over the years in which conditions in Europe and in Russia have changed, Russian society has also changed. The structure of the Russian economy has changed and Russian society has changed. You now have big-scale Russian investors who have invested in Russia and who have invested in the West. And the fall of the ruble vis-à-vis the strong currencies, mainly dollar and euro, is hurting these people tremendously and their economic interest. I don't know how big the influence is of the so-called oligarchs on Putin and the leadership, but people who know Russia better say that there is quite a close association between these two circles. So I imagine that as the level of frustration in this oligarch group rises, the pressure on Putin and the current leadership will also rise. Not from today to tomorrow, but it will rise. A second aspect that has changed in Russia during the past 10, 15 years is the evolution of a middle class. You have had Russians over the past years who were able to travel to the West. When you drive on Germany's Autobahnen, you see big Mercedeses and big Porsches with Russian license plates. And there are families traveling in these cars. It was unthinkable during the time of the Cold War. I was in Turkey last year for a conference at the Turkish Riviera in the south. There are these huge hotel bunkers at these beautiful Turkish beaches. 10 years ago, you saw German and British tourists there. Last year, 60% Russians. Russian families, not rich people, but families, people with 3, 4, 5 children, grandparents. There is a group of Russians that has become accustomed to spending their holidays abroad. If their income is divided by 5, because the ruble is only worth 20% of its original value anymore, they will not be able to travel to the West and afford this. Now you can feed them with nationalism for a while and try to compensate, but in the long term, this will have an effect.
Does Europe need to provide Putin, and truthfully, I hate personalizing foreign affairs, but in this instance, does Europe need to provide Putin with some face-saving out of the current predicament?
That is a very difficult question. The fact that Russia annexed the Crimea is a clear breach of international law, and nobody, not Europe, not the West, can simply say, we forgive and we forget. None of us stands above the law, and the law states annexation is not a possibility. And we make this very clear at the United Nations every day. Now, when it comes to finding a way out of the dilemma in the Ukraine mainland, excluding the Crimea question, and if we agree that there is no military solution, every diplomatic solution must include an element of face saving. You will not arrive at a diplomatic solution by putting one person out of the window and everybody else being allowed standing in the room. So I don't know what it can be. I think the way to finding a solution is negotiations between the parties, is reforming the Ukrainian constitution so that it better accommodates minorities, especially those in the east of the country. And I think if we are able to pursue such a process and there is no renewed major bloodshed or aggression, the solution that we will get will have to be a negotiated and balanced one and will automatically provide a face-saving element for everybody at the table.
In the very few moments we have left before we go to the audience for questions, let's turn just for a little while to the United Nations itself. I'd like very much to know what is on your agenda, Germany's agenda, at the United Nations in the year to come.
Thank you for this question.
You earned it.
2015 is a very important year for the United Nations. It's its 70th anniversary, and it is the year in which, at the end of September, at a global summit, the United Nations, and that is all of us, all nations united, all 193, will decide on a new 15-year plan for sustainable development. This plan has been worked out over a period of almost 2 years. It will be tabled in September, and it will be decided by the heads of state and government of all 193 member countries. Germany has actively participated in bringing this program about, and many of our priorities are reflected in this. I mean, the United Nations are there to maintain peace and security on the one hand, and to set conditions for human development on the other hand. And it's this human development side for which the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, have been defined. That is, eradicating poverty in the world, bringing better health conditions to regions of the world where they do not exist, strive for greater gender equality, and so on and so forth. I don't want to go down the catalog. All these points are important for Germany. Now, where do we set our individual, personal marks in the United Nations? Together with Brazil, we have introduced a year ago a resolution that the General Assembly passed, and that we'll introduce this year again, for internet privacy, human rights, civil rights are high on our agenda, and we feel that the area of privacy in the internet is one that is underdeveloped until now, and that action is needed there. So this is one of our highlights. Another one of our highlights that we have been pursuing with our African partner Gabon is poaching and illicit wildlife trafficking. When I heard this for the first time, I said, what? What does the United Nations have to do with poaching and illicit wildlife trafficking? What's behind that is the killing of 100,000 elephants in Africa every year, threatening the species, equally threatening rhinos. For what reason? For the reason of selling rhino horn and ivory to markets in the developed world. A pound of rhino horn is worth twice the value of a pound of gold. All of this is illicit, and where does the money go? The money goes into the funding of terrorism. Groups like Boko Haram, groups like ISIS, Daesh, they live to a large extent on the revenues from this illicit poaching and trafficking business. So apart from the aspect of protecting the species, it has very serious security consequences for us. So this is another of our marks. And then Germany tries to be a positive factor in all the other spheres that the United Nations is active. We are the third largest contributor to the United Nations budget, be it UNICEF for children, be it the Refugee Fund, be it the humanitarian work of the peacekeeping. We are number 4 only, but that's also considerable. We do provide peacekeepers, blue helmets to the United Nations. So our overarching goal in the United Nations is to be a good citizen of the world.
Thank you. We'll now turn to the audience, who I'm sure have many questions. There are portable microphones. We'll start with the young man with his hand up there. And if you could stand up, introduce yourself, and then ask your question.
My name is Miles Rogers, and I just was wondering, you mentioned that Germany has 27% of its power come from renewable sources. I know that's been attempted in the United States to a much lesser success rate. I'm wondering if you could perhaps expand on the successes Germany's had, the policies it's instated, and just how it's been able to get almost 30% of its energy from renewable sources.
And we'll take a second question. Yes, right here.
Hey, my name is Kevin Flynn. I'm a student at the Metropolitan Campus. You, in your speech, rightly decried the annexation of Crimea by Russia as a breach of international law. I was wondering if you could share with us Germany's position regarding the Israeli annexation of portions of the West Bank, as well as Morocco's annexation of the Western Sahara.
Why don't we start with those two?
I start with the second question. On both the question of the West Bank and the West Sahara, resolutions have been passed by the United Nations, spelling out the illegitimate character of these moves, and Germany has voted for both these resolutions. So this is our position. Coming to the question from Miles Rogers on renewable resources, the major renewable resource of energy in Germany is wind energy at this point. And this came about by government subsidized programs to establish large wind parks, both onshore and offshore in the North Sea. And then we've had programs to develop solar energy, tidal energy using the wave motion of the ocean. And there are 2 cities in Germany whose energy supply is provided by 80 or 90% by geothermal energy coming from the ground, from very deep in the ground, hot water. All this was made possible through distinct government policies to subsidize such programs. One policy which helped especially is the program to encourage private homeowners to put solar panels on their roofs and farmers to use solar panels in fields which they are not using for planting. And the national policy that private producers who produce excess energy will be able to feed this into the public net, and that the large industrial producers of energy will have to compensate the private users. So there are millions of tiny little energy producers who can not only provide energy for their own homes, but if they produce surplus, they are guaranteed that they will be paid for this surplus, which is fed into the national grid.
Thank you. We'll take the next 2 questions. The young lady in the back, and then the handsome gentleman in the first row.
My name is Rebecca Lucas. On the topic of Alexis Tsipras's recent call for reparations, which were as easily laughed off by Berlin as they were here tonight, whether they are psychological bravado or will be carried through, they do show that the people of Greece have not so quickly forgotten the lasting systemic catastrophe which was World War II. How can tensions between the 2 nations be resolved? And does Germany have a responsibility in alleviating these tensions, even outside of economics?
What was the country you were making reference to?
To Greece.
To Greece.
And we'll take the second question.
My name is Hamdin Riyati. Ambassador, it was really informative presentation. Thank you for this evening. You talk about many important subjects at the UN, but let me start with Ukraine issue. 2 important points. The sanction against South Africa worked after 25 years. Mm-hmm. And you know Iraq was under strongest sanction ever in the history of the United Nations, from 1990 when Saddam invaded Kuwait until 2010 during my tenure at the UN when we did sanctions. Now, when you said sanction is a slow remedy for the problem, we have to think of a smart sanction which target the criminal and not affect the victims. In Iraq, the Iraqi people suffer more than Saddam regime, who had billions of dollars, and make use of the oil for food program to get kickback from companies, which make them survive, but the Iraqi people suffer. And one example, the Iraqi dinar, which is the currency, used to be $3.3 before the sanctions, became 3,000 Iraqi dinar, equal to $1. So 10,000, more than 10,000 time devaluation of the Iraqi dinar. So my father imported his American car back in 1958 and his Mercedes from Germany in 1966. My family started to need money, and I start to send them money from England, where I live, while they used to send money to me when I went to England, number one. Number two, Ukraine, with the encouragement of the United States, put a resolution to the General Assembly to accuse the Soviet Union of killing 20 million Ukrainians during Stalin time by starving them. I was a member of the General Committee for 3 years as a chair of the third committee, and then vice president of the General Assembly, and then the sixth committee. And that resolution, unfortunately, was supported by the US. And the US Embassy in Baghdad talked to our ministry, who told me to vote for the resolution. And then I had to force my minister to change their position because I knew it was wrong. Now, Ukraine as a small country, when they step on the toes of Russia during Putin time, the reaction would be that Putin would take Crimea. Do you think the US or the West policies, wrong policies, cause this problem? The third point and the last.
You only get two.
Only two.
Only two.
This one, which is Ukraine, which I mentioned. This
That's
is the
fine.
second. Okay. The second point is ISIS. And you mentioned the migration and the terrorists. You know, we have German nationals with ISIS. I have pictures of them. And we have immigrants, of course, who joined ISIS. And many people were arrested. Now, when your predecessor, Peter Buttigieg, was in charge of the committee of sanction against Al-Qaeda and Taliban, again, the West asked us to remove Taliban from the sanction because there is moderate Taliban and there is fundamentalist and extremist Taliban. But you know what Taliban did recently? They slaughtered dozens of young children in a school in Pakistan. So what the UN is doing and what Germany is doing regarding extremists and terrorists, especially ISIS, because this is a cancer which will spread all over the world. Thank you very much.
So there's a lot of tough questions there. If I were you, I would stall for time. But I know you're a gentleman and you wouldn't do that. Maybe we'll address the question about Germany and Greece first and then turn to the others.
Absolutely. You asked whether Germany was conscious or not of its past. You were referring to World War II. And my answer there is a very simple one. Yes, Germany is very conscious of its past. Germany is aware, or the German people are aware of the fact that our parents, grandparents, grandparents created conditions in our country which made it possible for a criminal leadership to start two wars in the 20th century. This is shameful for us as a nation. We do feel shame for this. We say this was wrong. We hope that our people have learned from this. And if I look around in my generation, I was born 7 years after the end of World War II, and the generation of my children and grandchildren, I have the impression that the Germans have learned the lesson and are not amongst the warmongering nations in the world again. And what I try to teach my children and my grandchildren is that as Germans, we have to do even more. We have to make positive contributions so that wars anywhere in the world will not happen again. The question of compensation has gone through, has occupied the winners and losers of World War II for 2.5 decades, from the 40s into the 60s. International conferences were held, most prominently the London Debt Conference, and Germany had to repay its debt. It paid damages to many countries. It paid damages to Israel, which was not party to World War II, but so many Jews from Germany and their descendants found a new home in Israel. So huge compensations were paid to this country too. I'm not trying to say that the guilt and the wrong can be made up by money, but monetary compensation was part of the programs. The establishment of the European Union, to which Germany has contributed politically and financially, is also part of the post-World War II development. And so my conclusion is that we have done and we are doing what we can to make up for the wrongdoing of World War II, most particularly as far as the Holocaust is concerned. And we try to be good citizens for the world and help to make a contribution, for example, in the United Nations, to a prosperous future of the entire globe, of which we feel integral and in the meantime positive element. Now, as far as Ambassador Al-Gatti's contributions and questions were concerned, I mean, you addressed again the issue of sanctions, which in the case of Iraq did not have the same positive effect as they had in the case of South Africa. I'm not saying that sanctions are the perfect remedy in every situation, and I think I've not said this in my previous statement. We need targeted sanctions appropriate to the situation, and there have certainly been cases where sanctions were not appropriate. I think what you said on the Ukraine resolution, genocide resolution, and on ISIS were basically statements to which you probably don't expect an answer from me. And I understand that we'll have the opportunity to share a class after this, so maybe we can continue our exchange.
I'd like to thank everyone for coming this evening. Our next UN Pathways event will be on April 1st on the Metropolitan Campus, when our guest will be the permanent observer or nuncio from the Vatican. We'll see what he knows. We will have transportation from the Forum campus, so I hope some of you who are students here will be able to join us in Teaneck. But for now, I'd like you to join me in thanking Ambassador Blanc.